Blasphemy is an offense to religious sentiments. In secular democratic countries, while blasphemy laws protect the rights of minority religions and attempt to preserve social harmony, they are heavily criticized on the grounds of being unconstitutional and obtrusive to freedom of speech. Critics also believe that these laws are counterproductive and instead push society to be more intolerant of social and religious reforms. Merit of religious criticism do not, however, disregard the potential risk to social harmony and possible validation of hostile behavior veiled under the garb of critique. What matters, what makes matters more complicated is the active rise in interreligious and intersect hatred and access to platforms to express opinions publicly that could potentially be provocative, aggressive, and hurtful to the sentiments of certain groups. Though India does not have explicit blasphemy laws, critics believe that free speech and radical thought is repeatedly restricted. How should India navigate between blasphemy, heresy, and hate speech? Is it justified to trade some part of individual freedom for an attempt at social peace? Should blasphemy be punishable in India? Welcome to Argumentative Indians. Joining us today for the panel are Mr. Sandeep Ghosh, political commentator and columnist, Ms. Shubhrashta, founder at The Churn, a columnist and writer, Dr. Lenin Raghuvanshi, a human rights activist, political thinker, and social entrepreneur, and Mr. Yashwardhan Jha Azad, chairman at Deep Strat and former special director of security with the Government of India. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to invite Dr. Raghuvanshi for some starting remarks to initiate with the discussion for today. So you're on mute.
I'm not in the favor of any laws to prescribe the god and goddess because we need in the world to discuss and to create a critical thinking. But it is also important to respect the indigenous wisdom through the critical thinking. So mostly, my thought process, we need to be handles the hate, speeches, mob lynchings, and attacks on others, and also to create the discussion and debates about that. But these laws are always used and misused in different countries. So we need the laws on the to control the hate crime, but not this blasphemy, because that was always misused. And if you look, not only the Indian spirit of the Indian Constitution, as well as also in the different religions, just like in the Sanatan religion, we have the Shastra. You already discussed about the critical inquiry and logical reasonings mentioned in the Nyaya Sutra, and also in the Pake Quran in 1025. Talk about the home of the peace, mean the peaceful dialogues. And the Rasul, Muhammad Sahab, also created the Medina Constitution, where we discuss about the diversity and pluralism. And diversity and pluralism is so important. And for that reasons, we need to create a discussion. And there is many non-believers like Buddha, Staunch philosophy, and many thought process. So we need to respect them. But also it is also too important. Discussion is not going to use hatred. Discussion are going to real academic inquiries and to understand more deeper about the humanity. It is not like that to use as a tools to prove their own religions and own traditions are the one of the best and others are the inferior. So that is my initial thought process. So then I will give my remarks in
Right. So according to you, if I've understood you correctly, you are not in favor of blasphemy laws in order to protect the pluralism of religion and to create spaces for non-violent discussion and more cohesive discussions. Right.
Yeah, peaceful discussion. Yeah.
Right. So Brashta, would you have any remarks on that?
Yes. Thank you, Argumentative Indian, for giving me this platform. By and large, I completely agree with what Mr. Lenin has said, for the reason that in a secular democracy, there is no place for blasphemy, for a word like blasphemy. In fact, the word blasphemy itself is blasphemy for a secular democracy, especially in the Indian context. Now, why do I say so? Because first of all, we have freedom of speech and expression, and those freedom of speech and expression has been not just guaranteed by the constitution, but also controlled by the constitution in more than one ways. There are specific safeguards in place where if you really hurt the religious sentiments and cause social disharmony in society, there are laws to take care of that particular aspect. Upheavals in the law and order situation and all that. So I don't particularly see a need for separate blasphemy law. In fact, the moment we acknowledge the very idea of blasphemy, it is to say that we somehow acknowledge the idea of religious supremacy. We acknowledge the idea of religious fundamentalism, and which is where India, at the moment, till our constitution is not changed, fortunately, till we continue to be secular, I don't think there is a place for something called blasphemy law. Also, the very idea of having this discussion, blasphemy is anathema to democracy itself, because democracy is all about freedom of speech and expression, and it is about acknowledging that power lies in the hands of people. And so when we say blasphemy, and when we ascribe a deity or a religious order or any kind of a religious congregation a greater power than that of people, and by people if we go to the Indian philosophy, people would essentially come down to individuals. An individual, the whole idea of swa, the whole idea of enlightenment of one's own being. Gautam Buddha is an example of how he became enlightened. So in that sense of the term, society as a collective of individuals, in that sense also, is that the whole idea is very anathemic to the idea of pluralism also, as Mr. Lenin said. So I think I believe that blasphemy laws have no place in a democracy. So there shouldn't be a question of making it punishable under any circumstance.
So there needs to be that celebration of pluralism. There needs to be that celebration of differences in the communities. And according to you, no other deity or no other power could be more supreme than the people themselves in a democracy. Right. But time and again, just to be, the devil's advocate, it's also true that time and again, we have seen that in a democracy, because of the very pluralism that exists, there are conflicts between religions. There are also conflicts within religion. And often the law that you mentioned, 295A, in which any sort of hurtful remarks or any sort of insulting remarks towards any religion can be prosecuted. It can be punishable. So in the execution, then often it is criticized that India already has blasphemy laws to a certain extent. And I would like to hear more from Mr. Azad here on the execution of such laws and how then the public discourse is shaped through such norms. Sir.
Yes, let me first lay down the premise of this debate before I, build my arguments. If you're talking about blasphemy, blasphemy has different connotations, In the Islamic world, it's different. In modern democracies, it is different. India is a secular state, so we have taken the best from both. You see, blasphemy, anything which is said, any act, word, expression against the tenets of religion, against the sacred text, against, the deity is blasphemy. And therefore, in where blasphemy laws are really applicable in Islamic states, the punishment is very, very severe. So obviously, at the first instance, I would say no, there is no place, because there cannot be any free debate, there cannot be any kind of a constructive idea, which is the basic tenet of democracy and the freedom of expression. And look at India. India's experience over whether it's a Ram Mohan Roy against the Sati Pratha, whether it's against the Hindu Succession Act, there are so many things which have happened only because of constructive ideas coming in. So that would be considered blasphemy in those days. Look at people like Ambedkar, the icons we have, Periyar or Bhagat Singh, they were against. So blasphemy per se has no place in an age of reason. But my second point is that yes, in a secular state like India, you need to govern. There are ground realities. And as you rightly said, there are going to be conflicts over religion. There are communal brigands on both sides. So what do? We have these laws. We have enactments like 295A, and 295A gives you, it's like, when the Irish reformed their laws in 2021, then they said that it's secularizing the blasphemy law by taking a stand against hate speeches. If you take the example of the Western democracies, you see there are three types. The first, which have just done away with it. I mean, whether it's UK, whether it's Ireland, in USA, it's a misdemeanor. And in places like Germany, it's more like India, where it says if the deed creates a kind of a public disorder, then it's going to be actionable against. So a very practical kind of approach has been taken. Unlike the blasphemy laws, say, in Pakistan, where you've recently heard that the Pakistan Supreme Court has released Asia Bibi, a Christian. Why? Because in 2010, she was convicted with the death punishment. And why? Because she had some conversation with the neighbors, and it was constituted as insult to prophet. So what I'm saying is, in a secular country like that, you will definitely have religious rifts. There will be communal brigands. For example, both the BHP and All India Personal Law Board, they want blasphemy laws. They say that. On the other hand, the Organization of Islamic Countries, they have appealed to the UN that there should be a global law to tackle the insult to the religion. So there is a movement on one side that there should be a kind of a blasphemy law, which should be very, very severe. And then you have the secular states coming up, which say, no, we will deal with existing laws. Let me just read out, from one of the tweets, which was in response to the debate today, and I liked it so much. It's Michael Carvalho who says that the particular idea and the use of this particular word should be banned, as it triggers unwarranted reactions amongst people and can lead to very bad incidents. And one line more, he adds that any disrespect to any community or any individual in any form that may trigger social tension or social unrest needs to be dealt with under existing laws. So therefore, in the end, let me say that the constitutional validity of 295A has already been upheld by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has said that anybody who does it with malicious intent, and there is a proportionality with the harm it causes, 295A can be easily used. The question is, as you said, the use of 295A. And yes, there can be a debate later, and we can debate that. So the question is, you have the instrument in a secular state, it is the right instrument to be used. Now it's the question of institutions, which you have to work at in secular democracies like India, so that they maintain social harmony, which is the most, ultimately, what are we dealing with? Ultimately, what is our objective? The objective is to have a social harmonious state, building on the freedom of expression, building on the fact that there should be respectful reform in religions too. There has to be a constructive debate. So if there is a debate on triple talaq, if it's a debate on Hindu Succession Act, if it's a debate of what is going on with the churches, it has to be accepted by everyone. So that, in the end, again, my contention is blasphemy laws, no way. A secular state has the existing laws to deal with.
That's a pretty passionate appeal there, sir. Thank you so much. And from what I'm understanding, you are absolutely against the existence of any new blasphemy laws, but at the same time, you do uphold the value and the validity of the existing law that we have in our country, and you believe that the legality of it is pretty valid, but the institutional execution of it is what needs to be reformed further. Mr. Ghosh, would you like to add on to this? You're on mute, sir. Sorry.
I think the issue of legality and the various, the legal contours or how it is applied across the world, that's been very clearly articulated. I have little to add there. But the point is, whose law are we talking about anyway? Okay, so by law, you don't necessarily mean the law of the country, which has been legalized, but there are religions themselves advocating certain laws. Now, and that goes beyond the so-called purview of what your country's legal framework says. And that's where the problem arises. And I think the problem is much more, therefore, in quote unquote, in secular countries. Okay, because there is two sets of, you'll have parallel streams working. Certain religions will have their own laws or interpretation of law. And they say, my law stands supreme as far as my religion goes. And others don't follow that. For them, therefore, by default, is the country's laws which come into force or applicable. And rightly so, because, this whole again goes back to the question of definition of blasphemy. Certain religions have very clearly articulated, because especially the religions which we say have a book, okay, in their book, it is very clearly articulated what is blasphemy. In religions like our, which is more, as we say, are not codified, which are more a way of life, and there are a whole lot of sources and interpretations to go by, like Hinduism, even Buddhism. Okay, there's no single view of Buddhism or single view of the Buddha himself, about his life, about what his, how, his views on various matters. So you have different forms of Buddhism operating in different parts of the world. And mind you, the Buddhists have also not been as peaceful as we tend to imagine, or we have been told to imagine. So in those areas, it is very, very difficult, Yashwant raised the issue about whether it's a VHP or anybody else. Now, a VHP's view of blasphemy, or view of what is considered blasphemy, me being a Hindu, it may not coincide with that. Okay, whereas you'll find a much more uniform explanation of blasphemy in other religions. So anybody who's differing is usually a minority of one who is saying that this is so. So where do you go here? And from here, so therefore, certainly, I don't think any kind of legislation is going to solve the problem. Even if you have legislations in countries like, which were mentioned earlier, sometimes those do not stick to territorial jurisdictions, because as we have seen, say, in the case of Salman Rushdie just now, or anything, people can across regions invoke their own interpretation of own laws. So how do you do that? So I personally think, therefore, these two issues of even the, when we're talking about Section 295A, it needs to get separated, because from any direct correlation to religion, it has to be agnostic of any religion. It has to be a question of how you're disturbing public order, because as soon as you link it to a particular, as a reaction to some kind of a religious form, that's where you are inviting a lot more pushback or backlash.
So are you calling for a reform in the very law that is existing at the moment? Are you calling for a reform in
the application of the law? You see, as soon as you link it to any particular religious incident or religious, a belief or something, that's where you invite the backlash. But if you were to make it totally religion agnostic, that anything which disturbs public peace, which disturbs, whether by hurting somebody's sentiment in any form, that invokes this law, then you are on much more neutral ground. And to that extent, that needs to get defined. Because the problem which we, what is the problem, we encounter most of the time? People say, oh, there are double standards being applied. Somebody else offends my religion, you don't take action because you're afraid to take action out there. You're far more, lenient, or you give them far more, cut slack much more. But if somebody else says something against another religion, you are far harsher, you come down faster. Or to be, to be fair, somebody would say that, okay, because of changes in what's a favorite term now, majoritarianism, etc. Earlier, what you would have acted upon, today you tend to, the police or the establishment pull back, and they don't act as fast. So all those factors come in, and that's partly true. There are various elements which are going in different situations, political and other things. But if there is a clear mandate that irrespective of what is the trigger, you are going to come down uniformly on people. If there is this disturbance of social harmony and the rest of it, then probably you're on clearer grounds. That's my view as a layperson.
Right. All right, sir. So when you talk about the existing law against hate speech being just hate speech and not not have any religious connotations to it per se, but where do we really draw the line then? When does criticism against religion convert into hate speech? When does criticism against a particular religion become minority oppression? When does that criticism translate into provocative speech? That again is an execution that we could explore together. And I'd like to invite Dr. Raghuvanshi to address this part of the conversation.
Yeah, look, this is the most important thing we need to discuss because the hate is entirely different process. So, and hate always links with the violence. And this is the violence on the spiritual level, also the mental level and the physical level. So most important thing, you look in the Banaras, 600 years before, Kabir and Raidas criticized a lot, but there is no mob lynch. But nowadays, the whole philosophy of the Hitler and Mussolini came in this country and created a mob lynching. So we need to create a rule of procedures, and where we need to define the peaceful dialogue also, and government need to also engage, because I'm against the abstract secularism. France is facing. There's a big debates. We need to discuss about that. I'm in the favor of contextual secularism, and for that reason, it is very, very important. Sometimes we need to understand the tradition. Just like in the Islam, I will tell you, only people talking about the Quran were also quoted about the peaceful dialogue. But there is also Medina Constitution of diversity, where is also the rights of the non-believers. And this Muslim people need to understand why they are not following the spirit of Medina Constitution. Hadith came after 100 years. So we need to create this type of discussions also. And also inside in our religion, we have the Shastra, critical discussion, debate discussion. We did also many misdeeds like Adi Shankaracharya did with the Buddhists, but that is for our learning. So most important thing in the law, we need to be controlled any acts which is going to create the violence, attack on the dignity of any individuals or communities and any section of the society. And also we need to emphasize that process from our schooling and the education. This is also very important. Only creating the law, it is not very important. Look, it is also very important. We need to understand and develop, because the life is art. Life is not a science. So, and need to teach this arts from very beginning in our schools. So it is also very, very important, because we need to understand different religion, and also the religious people need to understand the thought process of the non-believers. But any fundamentalism, I am a supreme, my thought process, anybody is going to impose his and her thought process. Yeah, that is dangerous, and we need to control that. Because in that way we need to rule of procedures, how to use the 295 also. And but we don't want any blasphemy law, not only the secular country. I will tell you, any religious country, there is a 16 Muslim country in the world, but only 9 use the Sharia. So that is also important to understand Islam and other Christianities and all, because the peaceful discussion and debate is so important. Diversity is a reality, is a science. And any act which is going to eliminate the diversity and plural understanding And it is also important to develop the arts in the young people, how to respect the different opinions, differences. So that is very, very important. It is my thought process. It is not only going to control by law, it is important to bring into the educations to understand. And thank you to my grandfather who was a Gandhian, because he is better than my communist father. And I learned a lot of things because he's a very plural guy and he's always believing the dissent and disagreement. So that is very, very important to understand that. And otherwise, things are going to create a big problems. And his whole fascist ideas are creating a lot of big problems, like Islamic State who involved into the hatred and other things, very much against the spirit of Islam. Muhammad Saab came in Makkah, never did the revenge. So that debate also need to discuss. So we need government also create this type of discussion and debates also in the context of secularism. Otherwise, what is going to happen? This religious leaders for their political gains and other things, they are going to define entirely different way, or they are going to use their subjectivity in very different way. Thank you.
So, when you talk about religious extremism, and there needs to be the space for debate, there needs to be the space for conversation, and at the same time, we're also saying that no religious extreme or no fascist religious leader should have too much power. They should not have that much power to govern the public discourse, and people within that religion should have the chance to have that debate. They should have the chance to explore their religion and different norms and different laws of their religion. Can't the state then step into this and create legislation around it? And won't the anti-blasphemy law then create such a space where no extremism can happen in such a spaces?
I told blasphemy laws and always used by the dangerous people, means because there is a big. This is always used for to create the. To believe in the monolithic society. So people like me is not agree because we don't need this type of law. Most important thing, we need to control the hate and the violence.
Right. We need to control the hate, and we need to control the hate not just through laws, but through the execution.
Also the institution, and also we need to inculcate these values. Because there is a lot of morality, there is no values. So we need to inculcate these values in the young people, and it is also important to create a multi-layers, multi-dimensional process among the young people especially. Otherwise, what is going to happen? That is create problems because people have many misinformations also about their own religions and also about their other religion. And that creates a lot of big problems. And because populism and this politics to use the religions for immediate gain also is a big problem in the world, and this is the traits in the West also. So that is also important to. We need to create a law, and also we need to create a process. People develop their arts of the critical thinkings and the logical reasonings, and how to give the space to others, and also give the honor and dignity to different opinions. And okay, I'm not agree with you, but we are going to discuss further. Means the peaceful dialogues and the non-violent dialogue. It is very, very important. Otherwise, nothing going to happen.
Right.
And that we have very strong tradition of the Sastrartha, and for that we always criticize Yagbal because he used his sword to threaten to women. So that is that we don't want, and we need to be create a society. There is a lot of flower, many thought processes. We don't want one thought process like my father's created, like a communist thought process in his family. We don't want. So yeah.
So in the spirit of that pluralism, you're saying that you're absolutely against blasphemy laws, but my sort of argument still remains. Can't the blasphemy laws then protect minority religions from religious extremism? Dr. Azad, you had something to say.
No, I have a lot to say. I think, we must get real. I totally appreciate the spirit of Mr. Raghuvanshi that there should be interfaith dialogue. There should be talks, there should be rationality, reasoning, logic. But unfortunately, that is not there. Even in the Western world, there is a fractious debate which is going on. And even now, am I audible?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So the question is that in a secular state like ours, we have extremism. In fact, Mr. Raghuvanshi was talking about the youth. Let me say that radicalization is perhaps one of the most serious problems we have. Radicalization over social media, radicalization over various platforms of the internet is going on in full swing. And in fact, it was evidenced very recently and also earlier when some of our youngsters had gone from Kerala and they had gone to join the ISIS. Some of them never came back. Some of them came back totally disillusioned. Now, the question is that at one point, there should be interfaith dialogue. Nobody is doing a dialogue today. There is an atmosphere has been created that the dialogues are not being allowed because on every debate, there is already a rigid position which is taken. Look at, for example, whether it is hijab, whether it is anything, every matter is going to the Supreme Court. So what does the secular state do? Secular state has to rely on instruments like 295A. Making more laws is not going to make any difference. We already have a law against extremism. UAPA is there. So what is the question? The question is, and I agree with Mr. Ghosh when he says, it's a question of how you're applying these laws, the application of these laws. The only difference I have with him is that he's saying to make it neutral. Ideally, in an ideal state, it should be a neutral application. But the question is that you will see some kind of remark against a particular religion may arouse a massive mayhem, a massive reaction on the ground. Whereas against the other religion, it may not. So that doesn't mean that we don't use the application of 295A. As a Shiv Bhakt, I may be offended with something which is said about a Shivling, but it will not constitute or it will not turn into a ground war. That does not mean that that cannot be registered as an FIR. So these are issues we have to think about. How do you improve? How do you make it an uniform application? Is the question of how do you build around the institutions? So once again, I come to my pet issue, the police reform, the law enforcement agencies, our other institutions. And this is the most critical part in our democracy. Our democracy seems to be slipping on these basic institutions to keep them strong. Whether it's the Election Commission, where is the Information Commission? After all, people are seeking information through RTI. People are seeking institutions through various platforms. And if these institutions are all right, then I think we can go ahead with these democratic tools.
When you mentioned here that there are a lot of these FIRs that are being filed under 295A, and if I feel threatened because of someone's remarks, or I feel threatened because someone said something, someone created a movie or some content was generated, and then I am able to go and file that FIR and that is processed in a certain way. But in a country where already there is so much of legal backlog, in a country where there is already so much of drainage of resources with the police, with the law, how do you think then how viable is it that such FIRs are even registered and they are converted into such big controversies, whereas perhaps other kinds of FIRs might not find a similar resource in the institution? Why do you think that such FIRs are given the kind of institutional resources that they are given today, and should they be given such resources?
I could ask conversely, why isn't our society responsible enough to make stupid, idiotic statements? Why aren't our mullahs and pandits having the sobering influence on the society? Why is it that the elders today are not advising the youngsters? For example, take a very simple thing of satires. I have no problem if you lampoon or say anything funny about my Hindu gods. Fine. But why don't you do a similar thing against your own religion? If you are a true satire expert, do it all sides.
If there's
Why
an
are you doing that?
anti-blasphemy law, then no one gets to do it. So it solves the problem, doesn't it?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Anti-blasphemy law will again bring us to the realm of those theocratic states, and we can't afford to do that. We can't be an Islamic republic. And therefore, 295A application, if done judicially, is fine. But on the other hand, the society has to be equally responsible. Look at the kind of rubbish which comes on the social media from India. Look at the kind of good mornings and good evenings and good afternoons come from India, which is nowhere in the world. So as a society, we are also responsible. And we get the police we deserve, and we get the governments also we deserve. So what I'm saying is, secular state, you have your principles, run your institutions well. That is the way to look at it.
Right. So taking from you, and this question is for you, Shubhrashta. When there is that sense of focus on social harmony, there is that sense of focus on social reform, public reform, changing the way that people think, changing the way that people are talking. To what extent then do you think freedom of speech should even be sort of allowed in such a context where social harmony perhaps becomes a priority? Because you cannot, censoring people then again becomes a problem and again becomes inhibiting the right to speech. And talking about why are people speaking such rubbish, why are people posting such rubbish, why are youngsters speaking this way, it means again you are disrupting the freedom of speech. So how do we begin to balance freedom of speech and again laws against blasphemy or laws against any other such hate speech that exists to maintain social harmony?
Arzu, I think this is the age-old conversation, a philosophical conversation about laws versus lawlessness at the end of the day. This is what it boils down to. We can, of course, we have been discussing this whole conversation in the context of social harmony. But I think for me, the discussion on blasphemy, for me, it's basically in the context of a democracy. I'm not even going to discuss the secular aspect of it, because in India, secularism was brought in 1975. Before that, we were not really a secular nation. We were a dharmic nation. We understood, and the utopia that Dr. Raghuvanshi is trying to create about this whole idea of having free conversation between all religious interfaith conversations and all that. I think the essence of that was pretty much there when the Indian Constitution was promulgated in its original form. But whatever, we cut to 1975, we have the word secular introduced in. But I think for the context, for this particular conversation, I would just limit myself to democracy. Now, of course, there are pitfalls of democracy. Jawaharlal Nehru was once asked why he chose democracy as the form of governance in India. And he gave a very interesting answer. He said, because it's the second best form of governance. And when the person asked him, so what's the best form of governance? Why didn't we choose that? To which he said that it's not yet discovered. So it's not like democracy is the punisher for all ills. It's not that democracy is error-free. If you are going to give primacy to a collective rather than a set of elite individuals who get to decide who is Hitler, who is not, who get to decide whether India is a fascist country today or not, if you take it away from certain set of people and give it in the hands of collective, then it is going to be a problem for specific set of individuals, which may include you and me as well. We might not always, as individuals, we might not always agree with the collective. In fact, the entire, Christian literary tradition, the Christian English literary tradition is split between this debate between collectivism and individualism. So I think it's that very complicated and fantastic conversation that is also sort of weaved in this whole narrative of blasphemy versus democracy. I completely agree with Mr. Azad, because also Mr. Azad comes with a huge range of experience with the kind of professional experience that he has. He's very right to say that there's no need to introduce new laws. The existing laws have not been put in place properly. Most of the problems that we have in India are not because we don't have enough laws. It is because the implementation is flawed at multiple levels. And institutionally, we have failed our own systems in more than one ways. Why just blasphemy? Look at conversations around around rape, around gender-based violence. It's all to do with institutional failure. So to pin the entire blame of the conversation on A, society, or B, institution, or C, a government, or D, a particular form of government which is there in place today, is to be a little myopic. We'll have to look at the broader context. We decided as a nation way back that we chose to be a democracy. We chose to keep religion as a fundamental part of our being, but we did not allow it to influence policy. But we were not the West either. We did not choose the word secular to say that we distance ourselves from religion. Our Indian constitution in its original form has motives from the Ramayana and motives from various religions weaved into the pages. There's a reason why, as a dharmic tradition, we went forward with a certain way of understanding of conversations. I think the essence got lost somewhere. And all these conversations, I'm a little hopeful. I come from a hopeful generation, Arzu. I believe that all these conversations that we are having today is because we are going through a massive process of churn. And at the end of the day, wheat will be separated from chaff. And maybe I'm sure you're 10 years younger than me. Maybe your generation will be able to give us a better sense of how conversations should be. I agree that there's a lot of hate on social media. I agree that there's a lot of polarization with respect to the whole question of narrative in television, movies, cinema, so on and so forth. But then these are, at the end of the day, conversations. Unless somebody is lynched in the name of religion, which has happened, and I wouldn't deny that. Nobody can deny that. Where again, laws do come in place. In fact, I'll just give a very interesting example from Manipur. It has nothing to do actually with blasphemy, but it's to do with hate crime, because at the end of the day, we are discussing social harmony in this respect. So after the whole incident of mob lynching started happening in it, one after the other, media started covering some correct and some incorrect instances of mob lynching. Manipur actually came up with a very interesting law. The villagers in Manipur got together. This is the power of democracy. The villagers in Manipur got together. They passed a law. They took it to the state government and they said that we want it at a state level, that if there is a hate crime committed in a village, the entire village and some villages in the vicinity will be punished. Every individual will be punished from that village. I think that's an exceptionally well-crafted solution that has come from the people. This is the power of democracy. You don't need blasphemy laws. You don't need specific laws to target specific communities or to target specific purposes. Just allow people to be. As Mr. Raghuvanshi said, allow people to have free-flowing conversations. Solutions will come out.
Allowing people to be, and sort of the legislation being as it is at the moment, and strengthening the institutions instead, is what I could gather from the conversation. And you mentioned Manipur. I'd also like to mention Punjab in this scenario, where the law against Beabdi is prevalent. Law against sacrilege is prevalent. And the law was introduced to maintain a certain social harmony. The law was introduced because in the state, perhaps the lawmakers thought that it is important to protect the state and to protect the religion from any kind of sacrilege. So then, should different states have different kinds of laws related to this scenario? Do you think it makes more sense for certain states to have anti-blasphemy laws and not at the national level? Mr. Sandeep, would you like to add to this? You're on mute, sir.
See, Arzu, I like the word utopian, which Sudhashtra used, and earlier Ashwinji used the word, Ashwardhan used the word that, we must get real. And I am at heart a pragmatist. Having spent most of my life in the business world, I tend to take a slightly practical view of all these things. And therefore, what I told you earlier, all this dialogue and all the process is fine, but, at the state at which we are, to expect everybody, even the most enlightened person, to rise above, the pettiness of it, or whatever you call them, the more, bigoted view or something, is very difficult today. So we have to be realistic to that extent as to what is the lowest common denominator, which can enforce and gradually lift the bar up. Okay. Otherwise, there is always this reaction situation. As Azaji was saying, there was a time, I'm a Bengali and grew up there, we would make fun of our own gods in various ways. Okay? And that was done. But today, somebody doing that, immediately can trigger as you're being blasphemous or you're taking a pot shot at my religion. And as Raji very rightly said, somebody else, for his own religion, he may not be doing so. He could be doing it with others. And that's when, again, the point arises, why aren't you doing it with your own religion? So these reactions keep happening, all the time. And so we, I think, need to go, and I totally agree with Mr. Azad. The problem is on police reforms. The police doesn't have that ability to, and I honestly don't see that I don't see any political will. Any government, even the current government, and that's why the police reforms are languishing for ages over there. I think now the amount of dust that we have collected to get that off itself would be it's us, maybe bulldozers, as they say. For other stuff, you need to get the bulldozers to clear the dust over the police reform scale. Unless we move in that direction, I don't think we will get anywhere. And we'll go down a vicious spiral more and more. While I am, Subrashta always reminds me of how old I am by saying we are from the younger generation who are the more positive generation. But she could be, but even there, how soon the turn will happen to throw out something more meaningful. And I'm not blaming India. As we are seeing all over the world, it's not seeming to move towards a positive direction. Everybody is seeming to go down that little spiral or whirlpool, whatever you want to call it. So if that turn has to happen, it has to happen globally, not just in India.
When we talk about police reforms, that of course is a huge issue and a larger debate, perhaps for another day. But coming back specifically to the topic of blasphemy, oftentimes there is also this backlash that because there are no laws against blasphemy, whenever any sentiment is provoked, whenever there is any insult to any minority community or any majority extremist communities, there is that sense of injustice. There is that sense of shame. There is that sense of deep hurt that takes place for the community. And because there is no legislation available, because there is no harsh anti-blasphemy laws available, it translates into vigilante justice. It translates into mob violence, it translates into lynching, and it translates into heavy violence on ground. So in such cases, how do you think the police or the general society in itself should respond to it? Because some believe that anti-blasphemy laws might help remove that sense of injustice or remove that sense of hurt from these minority communities by protecting their sentiment instead.
I'll just come in for 1 second, if I may, Arzu, to just tell you, you're re-emphasizing on the minority bit a lot, but I don't think it really affects only the minorities, As I was telling you, say, in my religion, Hinduism, there are certain sections who might feel affronted or upset
Absolutely.
with it, which somebody else may not. So
Absolutely.
how do you define as a minority? Azad was talking about Shivbhakt. There are shades and shades of Shivbhakt. So, as I was telling you, in Bengal, we would sometimes make fun of Shiv for his various stuff, and other people may be much more, cutter. So you see that whole debate which happened on social media on Shivling rising from Banaras. It first hurt a very segment of people who are maybe more Kattar Shivbhakts, if you were to call it. But it drew into it a lot of people who were, who were not earlier Kattar, but they say, yeah, they have a point. Why should you start talking about my deity in that term? So it's not really related to minority, and that's where I think the problem arises. As soon as you say this law is for minorities, you will get a lot more backlash and pushback.
Right. So there seems to be the sense that a sense of distinction that I'm understanding from all of you, Dr. Ghoshi and Mr. Razad and Shubrashta, that on one hand, there are people critiquing and satirizing and reflecting on their own religion, which I believe, Mr. Razad, you are more on board of and you are more supportive on that. But on the other hand, when it comes to someone critiquing or satirizing someone else's religion, that is what creates conflict then in your mind.
That
So
is
do
the
you
law
think?
about. That is the law about, because if you're critiquing your own religion, well, I mean, there might be, but you're not creating a disaffection between the two communities, right? 153 is any kind of incitement to disaffection between the two communities. And 295A is anything to do with the religion, defiling or any action.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, in a secular democracy, and Subrasta made some excellent points, like, democracy, there is a clear separation between the church and the state. We started with the Westphalian Treaty, and here also in a secular state where religion cannot play a prominent role in statecraft. So therefore, religion can be extremely private. We are not completely denying religion. It's completely in your private domain. But as far as the state actions are concerned, it should be absolutely separate. Hence, the application of this law. And for the correct application of this law, we have to have the right institutions. So if you take care of such incidents with these judicious application, how will the judicial application be made? By strengthening the institutions. Now, Mr. Ghosh talked about the basic thing. It's a raw nerve which strikes me every time. Police reform, I've spoken so much on it that I'm tired. But everyone knows, even the Chief Justice of India said a few days back, before retiring, that for the police to, gather some kind of a, comfort from the people and getting some kind of, praise, it has to do the right action, and to commit the right action, there has to be a requisite degree of autonomy from the political executive.
Autonomy
This is
from?
what we are talking, requisite autonomy from the political executive, which, of course, there is no political will there with any state across the political parties. So, awaiting that, what will happen? Awaiting that, yes, I agree with Mr. Raghuvanshi when he says that interfaith dialogue, the influence by the elders, we should keep pushing. And as Subrashta says, yes, we have to be hopeful. We have to be hopeful that the youngsters who appreciate this kind of a dialogue and come to some kind of a positive thing. And I'm sure with development of the economy and development on other axes, we may be able to achieve it. Who knows?
Again, perhaps to become the devil's advocate once more, but I keep hearing repeatedly that extremism is not what we want, be it in our own religion, be it in anyone else's religion, and we don't want to hear any extremism. We want to have healthy debates, we want to have healthy conversations, but we don't want extremism, we don't want religion to be governing our society, we don't want religion to be dictating our norms, we don't want religion to be creating violence in our society. So why not just create anti-blasphemy laws to stop that extremism?
No, we need to oppose, because look, I'm going to two ways, because we have our cognitive, and I'm going to discuss some cognitive in Varanasi also. We have also dialogue with our God and Goddess. We have many criticism with them. Also in our prayer, as a Kali Bhakta and Shiva Bhakta like me, and every Amavasya and every Purnima, I have very different prayers and altogether. Goraknath told, Hindu ka hai Devra pyara, Muslim ka hai Masjid, Jogi ka hai Param Dham na Devra na Masjid. So there is a lot of diversity, and we do. Most important thing to understand, in the contextual, we need the scientific temper, but we need also to protect the indigenous wisdom of the cognitive, which is very important, like Vajra Kutumbukam and Sasnar, another thing, like a Madina Constitution in Islam. There is no discussion about that. And I'm very hopeful. I will tell, it is a pregnancy time in this country. We don't want any anti-blasphemy law, any law on the name of blasphemy. We need to control hate, and we need to create the peaceful debates. And it is the pregnancy time, only mother to understand. I will tell you, wonderful things are going to come in the 2025 years. So, and that time you look, the manthan are going on. And when the Samudra manthan, there is also the poison and this and everything. So that don't worry about that. And I will tell you, you look, when the Professor Ratan Lal gave his remarks on the Lord Shiva, my God, where I love so much, more than anybody, anything, more than myself also. So most important thing, but I'm a person to make my efforts to release it. Because my Lord Shiva is a very different thought process, but if you are, and I need to engage him, and already I engage him in the discussion, internal discussion. So that is also very important, because this is also very important, very sensitive issues. But we need to create a lot of discussion and debates, and through not only by the also for the institutional reform. We are lacking the institution. What the Azad we told that. We have the fantastic law, we have the fantastic constitution, but very, very bad colonial, feudals, political control institutions. And we want to create real autonomy of this institution and the independence of this institution. And for that reason, we need to make a reform and create a rule of procedures, how to Supreme Court and the police and everybody is going to work that. And it is very, very important, because without the freedom and dignity and giving the respect to others, and for that, people like me also need to challenge my God sometime. And if any law is coming that's going to eliminate my old traditions of diversity and pluralism, and we don't want at all.
Right. Dr. Raghuvanshi, I completely hear you on this. And, but I also would like to quote, in fact, Mr. Ghosh here, that when we talk about something like this, it's important to have the lowest denominator in mind. And let's not think too ahead into a utopian world where everyone can have academic conversations, philosophical conversations about these things. And it is a sensitive nerve. Someone saying anything against my religion or anyone else's religion, it provokes passion, it provokes feelings. Now, those feelings can be very easily capitalized on and converted into mob violence. And in such cases, then, how worth is it to prioritize freedom of expression over social harmony?
Yeah, everything has their own limits. My freedom has the limits if I'm going to interfere into the freedoms of others. So it is a very old human rights discussion.
Right.
So it is also important, and why I'm telling we need to create rule of procedures, and for the rule of procedures, we need to be fantastic institution, and for that we need to reform. We don't want to create the laws, any laws. If we have sufficient laws, if we are going to create something on the education level, and also we are going to create the institutions and police reform, judicial reform, and we are going to create the very, very defined rule of procedures, then we are going to control. Because in any democracy, it is also very important. We need to heated discussion.
Right.
I have many heated discussions with my father, but we never created the violence, because I'm not agree with his communist understanding. But it is because I'm very Sanatan democratic guy, but I'm never imposing my own many my beliefs on others. So that is also important, because otherwise what is going to happen, very monolithic society, and that is going to create very different, and it is also the threat to use this type of laws, anti-blasphemy laws, to prosecute someone. And for the right to expression also, it is important people don't create to attacks on other dignities. Just like Jesus, when he told very bad things, especially the Catholics, I don't like it. And also in the Europe, because it is not a good. You are talking so patriarchal. You are attacking on the dignity of the women. That is not important, and that is also important to understand. And for that, we need to create not only interfaith, also shastras and discussions and different arguments, because it is also important we have recognized different thought process and different way of the interpretations also. Otherwise, very boring world.
But sir, usually how it plays out in the larger public discourse, at least in my experience, please help me if I'm wrong. And Mr. Azad, I'm directing this question to you in particular, since you have that experience in public security and dealing with, that sort of violence that takes place on ground. The sense of debate that we are talking about here, the sense of conversation and discussion that we are talking about here, sounds extremely academic to me and sounds very philosophical to me. That is at times perhaps limited to college campuses or limited to very closed circle conversations. But on ground, it can get dirty. On ground, it can happen that only the religious extremes are talking amongst themselves, that only an extreme from one side of a religion, an extreme from another side of a religion, or even a non-believer and an extreme believer are having this conversation. And that is what further creates violence. And that is what ends up driving the public discourse then, that the most sensitive people, or the most, for lack of a better word, most insecure people or most hard or cutter people end up driving these conversations. So how healthy is even this discourse at the public space right now?
It's very interesting that sometimes in the most, communally affected districts and headquarters, the biggest crooks from both sides, from both religions, are one. And they don't interfere in each other's territory to maintain that, peace in the area. Some of the best shooters with the Muslim mafia are the Hindus. And some of the biggest Hindu mafias will have the Muslims together. So there's great harmony at a particular level. It's totally professional. Now, I understand, and Mr. Ghosh has already talked about it, that, it's kind of a little utopian to say that a dialogue can go on in a fractious society like this. But nevertheless, the campus debates are debates which are uniquely popular across the world, whether it's Harvard, whether it's Oxford, whether it's, Hindu college or Stephen. Hindu is my college, that's why I'm saying it, or Delhi School of Economics. Yeah. But they make an impression. Even a debate of this kind, which you have done today, is going to mold and shape public opinion. I've already seen the tweets which are coming on this, and they're highly encouraging. But the question is, why these debates? I expect a lot from our pundits and mullahs and fathers and preachers. They are not doing that role. You know what is happening today? Earlier on, 2 decades back, and I think Dr. Raghuvanshi and Mr. Ghosh would also support me, and Shubrasta, these were wise old men and women from the religious leaders. They would be sort of disciplining the society. I'll tell you, I was posted in some of the most communally sensitive districts of Madhya Pradesh, whether it was Bhopal, Sihor, Mandsaur, Jabalpur and all these areas. And we used to go to the religious leaders whenever there was an outbreak. And they were the ones who would brief their communities. And when we had our peace committee meetings, they were the ones who used to come. So I would say this kind of a dialogue is very, very effective. And even the state should facilitate such a dialogue. This may not be only at a particular level. The problem is that we have lost all our moorings. And that is why I talk about institutions. The institution of SP, the institutions of collector, these are all supposed to unite people. That was the ultimate objective. But there is one thing, a secular state, while talking about the freedom of religion, is also a secular state when it has a firm control over any kind of expressions which display a lack of respect for any community or any religion. So which means, again, we're talking about the institutions, they have to be very, very firm. So dialogue should certainly go on, and yet the institution should be very firm in application of the laws.
This firmness can then go on to what bounds is what I'm wondering, because this firmness could also be very easily miscommunicated or misinterpreted in execution. For example, since you spoke about the responsibility that is there on religious leaders to bring together people, to make sure that they are wise and they inculcate that wisdom in their faith. But for example, say I am some religious leader and my faith talks about blasphemy as a sin. For example, in a lot of Christian sects, blasphemy is one of the 10 sins, is one of the 7 sins. And so if anyone stands up to me and tells me that, like Dr. Raghuvanshi was saying right now, that a lot of things in the Bible are patriarchal, are sexist, I wouldn't be allowed to say that because my faith tells me that I'm not supposed to say that. So should I as a pastor, or should I as the Pandit, should I as the Maulvi not have the right to preach my religion then, if my religion is against blasphemy?
You have every right to preach your religion within your community, there is no doubt. But you should not do any kind of allurement. You should not do any kind of inducement towards conversion. And number 3, the cardinal point here is the ultimate canon of law or norms is that there cannot be any violence to preach your religion. There cannot be any kind of public disorder or going against the laws of the land. And that is why it is said that even the freedom of speech can be limited once the state interests are there in public interest, whether it's security, whether it's law and order, whether it's harmony, etc. So that is why if the institutions remain firm, there would be no problem. In our area, for example, whenever any communal, you talked about the point of what would be the limit to and go to.
Yeah.
That an officer understands. I exactly know that if there's a communal breakout, I tell my police to fire, whether it's Hindu, Muslim, or any other community. So I will get the flak, but they will be no more. Immediately it is stopped. The Delhi riots, for example, and I said it on TV very, very loudly, it was the incompetence of the leadership that it did not take a firm control on the first day itself. And then it went on, it took about 5 days. So therefore, the institutions know how to react. And there are leaders in police, army, academia, everywhere, who know what is right and what is wrong. So it is up to them that we look up to.
Right. But, again, Shubhrashta, bringing in your point of having that churn taking place in the society at the moment and having that shift taking place where you are hopeful that things are getting better. To what extent then is this restriction of freedom of speech healthy to the fabric of the society in a democracy where we are talking about rights to expression and freedom of expression being very fundamental for every individual? So again, it comes back to the balance once more, that how do we make sure that these reasonable restrictions on freedom of expression and this massive trust that Mr. Azad is talking about in the institutions, in the leaders that are running the institutions, how does that trust within these leaders then translate into action on ground? Or can we even have that trust to begin with, considering how time and again it is misused, and time and again we see how fundamental biases become a part of the action on ground?
If I get your question correctly, Arzu, it is basically you're trying to ask me how do we ensure that the laws that are in place are not misused, right?
Yeah. So to rephrase my question, I was asking that freedom of speech needs to be restricted, is what Mr. Azad is saying here, in order to maintain certain.
It's a part of our constitution. It is restricted. It doesn't need to be restricted. It is restricted. You can't just go on to speak anything and everything you want under the sun.
Again, to what extent? And then why not anti-blasphemy?
So why not anti-blasphemy? Because we are a secular democracy. Therefore, blasphemy, the very word blasphemy is blasphemous to be used in case of a secular democracy. And to answer your question as to what defines reasonable restriction, well, that's a debate that even our constitutional fathers have not been able to really crack, which is why it has been left to the government of the day, to the society of the day, to the social fabric of the day to decide on. So whenever there are controversies, whenever there are cases, it reaches from the lower echelons of the court to the Supreme Court, and then Supreme Court, of course, steps in, and there are these whole there is this whole process of 3-bench and 5-bench and 7-bench Supreme Court judgments. So I don't think it is possible to define reasonable restriction in one go. I don't even think it is healthy to define it in 2022 and expect our future generations in 2062 to follow the same reasonable restrictions. What is reasonable today might be absolutely unreasonable tomorrow. What was reasonable way back in 1947 is absolutely unreasonable today. Look at the kind of communal conversations that we have on ground today. I mean, even at the peak of India's partition, I don't think the kind of things that are said on social media was there at that point in time. So I don't think it is right for us to actually start codifying what reasonable restriction is. Leave it to the sagacity of the collective. I am a huge believer in the wisdom of the collective. And I have a slight disagreement with Mr. Ghosh when he says that, we need to think of the common denominator. My counter question to him is, who are we to think of the common denominator? You mean the lowest common denominator? It comes from that sense of elitism that all of us are guilty of at some point in time, that we know better than people. I mean, and during this conversation also, we've heard how some people are overtly sensitive. So two hardliners will start having a conversation on blasphemy. Just leave it to the wisdom of the crowd. This country has stood the test of time. We are 75 years old now, from leaving our colonial legacy, though we haven't completely decolonized ourselves, but that should be a separate conversation. Just leave it to the wisdom of crowd. Allow people to have genuine conversations. And if there is an issue, approach the institutions with all your might. It might not always be that you and I are hurt to be able to take the course of law. If you feel that there are people out there creating a ruckus, take suo moto. I mean, if Supreme Court can take suo moto cognizance, I'm sure there are, young youth collectives who can take suo moto cognizance and file, various kinds of complaints and take it to the logical conclusion. So in the end, I would just say that let's believe in the wisdom of the crowd. Let's also believe that as a democracy, we are not a failure. We have had very smooth transitions to power. Unlike in the US, with the world's strongest democracy, and we just saw the kind of protest, the Black Lives, the BLM protest that happened. Streets of Washington, D.C. today are absolutely, they look very different than what it was like 10 years ago. Thankfully, we are not that democracy. We may be bitter in our argumentation, but we accept what the electorate and what the tenets of our democracy says. Just have faith in our own selves is what I would say.
Well, the nature or the quality of our democracy is a separate conversation to have, but it's very interesting, your faith in the wisdom of the collective, or your faith in the wisdom of the crowd when it's let to be and when it's left to make its own choices, its own decisions. But I'm also worried at times those decisions are of mob violence. Those decisions are ki chalo jaake jala dete hain. That is also something that can come out from the crowd. That is also something that can come out that, oh, I'm hurt. Are you hurt? Yes, we are together hurt. And now we need vengeance because the state is not doing anything. Because the state does not have anti-blasphemy laws, because the state is not listening to us. So we need to take matters in our own hands. So it could go in either directions. And how does the legislation enter in such cases then?
When people complain, when people like you and I complain that there are.
But do we wait for that to happen?
No, we don't wait for that to happen, but we can't always assume that, that people are going to get violent on ground. That the whole scene that you created about people, vandalizing certain properties, I don't think it has happened in the case. Please remind me of an incident where a group of people got together to say that this particular thing has hurt us. They have gone on to raise a particular structure and no backlash has come from the very same society. That society has very silently accepted that this is the norm. It has happened in Christian and Islamic countries.
Even in cases like when theaters are burnt because a movie has a scene that invokes religious sentiments, or we also tend to deeply criticize certain content. We also there are endless cases of mob violence. There are endless cases of lynching. There are endless cases where even creators are now self-censoring in fear that, it will invoke public outrage.
I think it's a part of a separate conversation, Arzu, because the quality of content and because at the end of the day, these content creators are not creating art for art's sake. They want a certain degree of commercial success. When you
Yes.
go out in the market, you are pandering to market
Yes.
sensibilities. If market sensibilities are hurt, your commerce will take a hit. That's a
So
choice that individual. And if they are so
And
passionate about your art
yeah,
and content, don't
just
change.
just 1 second, sir. Sorry,
you
just
know,
1 second. One counter question before I come to you, Dr. Raghuvanshi. Should then religious extremism govern public discourse, be it in the marketplace, be it in the public sphere, be it in the private sphere? That is the question.
I have a huge problem with the way it is being phrased. I don't think anybody sitting in the panel is talking about religious extremism taking precedence over everything else. But the simple point that is being made is that there are existing laws in place. I have a counter question to ask you. In case of the incidents that you select incidents you mentioned about theaters being burnt, etc. Did the entire community take it lying low? Were people not up in arms against the very same people who went and vandalized? I can give you examples. When the whole Karni Sena attack happened with respect to that movie, I don't remember the name of the movie. It was that movie about Rajasthan pride and everything. I don't remember the name. There were so many of us on social media, on ground, actually protesting against the very same law. We just believe in the justice of the crowd. But if certain set of individuals would want to assume that their content is more sagacious and more in tune with what should be, then it is going to be a problem. Don't teach the public or don't teach the collective that there is a formula that you have cracked of how to live a life, how to present art in a particular way. And by all means, you are free to do that. Then hold, those separate premiere sessions for your friends. But if you bring it out to the market, the market will react in a certain way.
Isn't that anti-blasphemy then to begin with? If I am
no,
unable to make a movie
No,
about,
no.
and I'm asking you, Dr. Raghuvanshi, for example, if I want to make a movie about how the Hindu religion or whatever religion is patriarchal in these many ways, and the crowd then outrages, then do I not have the right to make that movie?
you look, very important. 2,500 years before, Buddha created discussion against God. He smiled on the name of the God. So we have very old tradition, and we don't want to destroy that. It is we have the proud of that. And the second important thing, we need to understand the collective wisdom also and indigenous wisdom. I will tell you, in the May 2014, Modi ji came in as a prime minister from my city, and we talked and we organized a collective Banaras convention where all regions come together and to announce two things. Because Barbara told democracy prefers market. Market doesn't prefer democracy. So understand we need to make it accountability of market also. And here is a corporate fascism, not the Hindutva fascism, I will tell you. And we are going to discuss and debate and discuss about that. And the second important thing we need to understand, because it is not to the anti-blasphemy laws, but we need to control the hate very differently and also to believe in people's wisdom. And the people's wisdom is going to fight back. You look, many processes are going also happen parallelly. And here, first time in the history, I will tell you, people started to discuss about the Hitler and Mussolini, because no mob lynching of the Kabir and Raidas in this country. What the Kabir and Raidas told 600 years before. But Guru Golwalkar ji brought to the Hitler and Mussolini in our country, and our some young people learned about that, not through the Vedas and Upanishad and Mahopanishad of the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and all. And for that reason, and there is a big discussion inside my community. I am a person to oppose Karni Sena. And I'm a person, because I studied in Gurukul. I'm the Arvidachar. I talk with the Mohan Bhagwat ji, and I discuss many things. It is not our way. It is not our Hinduism. It is not our Sanatan. So there is a big discussion is going on. Something, everything. हर चीज दिखाई नहीं देता है, दिखाई देता है सूर्य पृथ्वी के चारों तरफ चल रहा है, पर सच्चाई है कि पृथ्वी सूर्य के चारों तरफ चल रही है. So many things are also happening while the Sushta talk about that. And the first time in history I observed inside in Banaras, there is a big discussion. And for this big discussion, there is a decrease of the 4% of the political Hindus, like a political Muslims. So decrease, not increase. after this regime. So that is very, very positive, I will tell you. And there is a many discussion which is not coming on the social media, but there is a big discussion inside. And very, very, very strong discussion about the first time in the history about the Sanatan and the Vasudha Kutumbam, Shastrat and everything, and like that. So that is also important also about the Manusmriti. It is not part of us because it came after Buddha and the Parni and like that. So it is, and also the alliance of the Hindu Mahasabha and Muslim Leagues in the 1936 and 39.
Right. Just to again, right. So again, the conversation around discussion and debate and having those conversations is truly there, but again, bringing it to the conversation of wisdom of the masses, does it also then become majoritarian in a certain way? And also, Mr. Azad, your hand was up. Please, I'd like to hear you.
I wanted to make a very small and limited point that, if Karni Sena comprising 100 people or so go and, vandalize a theater or sit doing patrao or something, it doesn't make a difference to the strength of our democracy. It happens all over the world because lakhs and crores of people oppose their move. The only difference is that these lakhs and lakhs of people are more civilized, so they display their protest through social media and not doing cross patrao against them. So I don't think that is an issue in itself. Secondly, such patraos which take place, it's the matter of the state. We should firmly put it down. But the problem is that the state governments, their proclivities are also according to the dominant ideology of the state.
Absolutely.
So therefore, the same Karni Sena will do it in a particular state, but they'll dare not do it in some other state where the proclivities are different ideologically. So I don't think we should worry about it. That's why I said, once we have a mature democracy and the institutions are act firm, for example, if it happens in my district, I'll use a danda charge and throw them out. Whether I'm transferred or not, it doesn't make a difference. So, it's a question of a simple law and order problem which should be tackled, and we should not, elevate it to any other.
Sir, keeping it at a law and order problem, like I also mentioned earlier, Punjab has a Beabdi law. Nowhere else do we have a law against sacrilege, but we do have it in Punjab, perhaps because of all the religious violence that has taken place already. So do you support then anti-blasphemy laws or anti-sacrilege laws depending upon state to state demographic? And
Never. In fact, I would say that the 295A++ is a minus. In fact, Punjab is a robust state. It was one of the richest states, and now it has come down. It has come down to 9th or 10th or 11th. Punjab hasn't seen a proper law and order. It has changed about 13 DGPs. Look at where the actual malaise is. The malaise is not that somebody comes and, jumps over the text and, tries to defile a sacred text or something like that. That is not the issue. Is how are you maintaining your law and order regime? Maybe, and you see the kind of persons who have done it, they should get the punishment. But to have a special law of this kind is wrong, is absolutely wrong, because you can't become a theocratic state. That is the signal which you are giving. And I think no state should be allowed. For example, in Australia, they had this common law when they came into being with whatever it was, I think 1760 or something. And the blasphemy law was of 1697. But in 1995, Australia abolished all this blasphemy law at a central level. But there are 2 or 3 states which have still kept that law because of the federal character. Let them keep it. It doesn't matter. But it's hardly used. Denmark, for example, still has it, but they've used it only twice in 3 centuries.
Even in France, with the Charlie Hebdo case, we saw that France had abolished blasphemy laws way back, but in one little province, it was still allowed. And that's when the Charlie Hebdo case came into the picture. Sandeep ji, would you like to add something to what Mr. Azad is saying?
See, I think I'll just first add a bit to what Shubhrashtra said to clarify my position. I don't believe in defining which is the lowest common denominator. I think lowest common denominator also gets decided by what she talked about, the collective wisdom. It automatically, it's like, sand settling below in the water, you will get that. And that's a process of, I think, trial and error, how it happens. The other dimension which I'd like to bring in, by agreeing to whatever Mr. Azad and everyone said, is we talk about politicization of our institutions. One of the things we don't talk about is the politicization of our religious, whether you call them the institutions or, leaders or sections, because they have been weaponized, or religions have been making use of them. That's why what Mr. Azad was saying earlier, it's my belief that you don't get that degree of neutral, point of view or interventions which used to happen earlier. Swami Vivekananda, when he formed the Ramakrishna order, he had made it a condition that none of their monks or the institution can take any religion. In fact, technically, they're not allowed to vote. Okay, now that's sometimes you cannot enforce this because of our current laws, but the unwritten injunction is the monks don't even vote. Okay, and they equally entertain people from both sides, of the political spectrum who come or whatever it is. That's how they do, because they do not look at the government or anybody for patronage. They are not. It is because that has changed across religion. You're not getting that sort of dialogue. And in fact, when you get back also to our intellectuals or elitists, as Shubhrashta calls them, I find those conversations today have become more problematic. If you hear conversations on those platforms, you go and hear such conversation in IIC in Delhi, you find people are far more polarized in these issues. They're not willing to have the conversation we have had just now in the last 1.5 hours. So that's where the problem arises. And that's why I agree with Subrata. The answers won't come from this lot. Answers will have to come from the common people. Because those who believe that they are the repository of greater wisdom, they are themselves today vitiated. Their whole opinion is vitiated, and they're not, and because they have also got very politicized. They cannot really take a politically agnostic or religious agnostic stand. And that's something which has to change. And this whole item, I use a strong term called weaponization of the religious orders. That is, I think, very, very dangerous. It used to earlier happen in certain communities, but now whether you justify it through a backlash or whatever, it's happening everywhere else. And that is where you're getting into so much more volatility or, which is in the system.
Right. I'd like to pick up a phrase that you use, trial and error, finding out the common ranks or the elitism through trial and error that is taking place in the society. And it also worries me a little because this trial and error is rid with different social categories and different caste and class categories. But again, that's a different conversation to have.
Dialectics, which, Subrata mentioned, you will be having thesis, antithesis, and then finally get into synthesis at some level. But that's happening in a rather macro context, rather than just a trial and error. So that's it.
But the cost of this trial and error, just like the cost of freedom of speech or the cost that is there to be able to produce the kind of content you want to produce, to be able to say whatever stupid thing you want to say online or intelligent thing you want to say online. And who decides what is offensive, what is not, what is stupid, what is not, who decides when to have a lathi charge and when to not. Those are the conversations that I feel would still remain endless and continue to question them for eternity, as long as there is that dynamism in our society and there is that sense of dynamism in our legalities. Thank you so much to everyone who's on the panel today. And it was such an enriching conversation. I got to learn a lot. Thank you, everyone. And would love to know from our viewers what are their opinions on this matter. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks to all the panelists.